so much hope and so much faith was placed in this man. And of course, for many people, things like the Corona Investigative Committee were a lifeline during 2020 and 2021 when there was so much darkness. And at least there you saw what appeared to be an attempt to grapple with and get to the truth. And people invested heavily in these characters, and particularly Reiner Fuellmich. But all of that to then be unraveled, and you realize, oh my goodness, this man, was just either out to make money or worse. The psychological impact that will have on many people will be quite devastating.
Hej och välkomna till Folkets radio. Welcome to the People's Radio. Today with Dr. David A. Hughes. Welcome.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be with you and to have this opportunity to reach a Swedish audience.
It's great to have you. And we're going to talk about your recent article on how the narrative is being controlled, especially in the alternative space. But before we go there, if you could tell us a bit about your background. You have written extensively about the brainwashing and psychological manipulations during the COVID era. And in 2024, 2 years ago, you decided to leave your academic profession, and you write on your homepage that everyone can and must do something to resist the technocratic system of human enslavement. So maybe that's a good place to begin, if you could tell us a bit about your journey and how you arrived at this decision.
Yeah, thank you. I'm absolutely right. I mean, everybody can and must do something to resist what is taking place transnationally at the moment. So my background is in academia. I got my undergraduate and master's degrees from Oxford University. I then got 2 PhDs, one in German studies, one in international relations. I taught for 11 years in full-time continuous employment in academia in the UK, and in many ways everything was going fine. I never intended to be doing this kind of work. But then, of course, 2020 hit. And just prior to the COVID crisis, I'd published an academic journal article asking critical questions about 9/11, which was not well received by the academic community. And as I watched things unfold during COVID, I became increasingly horrified by what I was witnessing. I noticed numerous parallels with the Nazi past, and that's something that I have extensive knowledge of, having studied it for many years. And I became increasingly dismayed by the failure of academia to challenge power in any meaningful way, to have anything genuinely critical to say about these atrocities and crimes that were being committed worldwide. So in the end, I took the decision to leave the profession in 2024, which coincidentally was when my 2 books were published, COVID-19 Psychological Operations and the War for Technocracy, which, as you say, goes deep into the psychological operations that were used during the COVID era. And my other book, Wall Street, the Nazis and the Crimes of the Deep State, which seeks to provide more of a historical context for what's been going on. So since then, that was about 2 years ago, I've been in the independent media space, and I'm just doing what I can to try and kind of explain the bigger picture of what's happening and to make sense of the chaos.
So you write in an article that a global class war has been unfolding since 2020, in which a powerful and transnational ruling class has gone to war against the rest of humanity. So, during COVID, it really became visible that this is a global entity. It didn't matter if you lived in the UK or in Russia or in Iran or in Israel. It was the same measures basically everywhere. And then in 2022, all of a sudden, the pandemic was declared to be over and life supposedly went back to normal. How do you see the continuation of this war against humanity since the pandemic?
Yeah, I guess the clue is in the title of my book, COVID-19 Psychological Operations and the War for Technocracy. So my thesis is that a transnational ruling class is now essentially acting as one to suppress and ultimately enslave the world population. I think that the writing for this has been on the wall for many decades, actually. But what we saw in 2020 was quite unprecedented and, as you described, involved an extraordinary level of coordination by all states, really, which were clearly acting pretty much on the same page. I know in Sweden there was a brief moment of exception and resistance compared to other countries, perhaps in terms of the measures. But by and large, we were looking at a transnational phenomenon which was vicious, and the psychological warfare deployed against entire populations was multifaceted. It was complex. It had evidently been planned for a very long time. It involved shock techniques, trauma-based mind control, the use of fear, applied behavioral psychology, and many other elements, which I described not only in my first COVID book, that was just volume 1. I'm busy writing volume 2 at the moment. So all of this was going on, and so it begs the question: why? What was it all for? What's it all about? And my thesis is that the ultimate goal is to build a technocratic world state. So this involves the abandonment of the nation state model. It involves dismantling liberal democracy, and it involves instituting an entirely new model on a global scale, which is technocracy. So yes, on the one hand, the COVID operation was wound down in 2022, but by then it had largely served its purpose in terms of attacking the minds of the population and weakening the will of populations to resist this intended transition. But what have we seen since 2022, and particularly in the last couple of years? Evidently, the rollout of technocracy, which is now gathering pace across the world, being fueled by AI, attempts to digitize government, to outsource decision-making from human beings and elected representatives to algorithms, and so on. In the United States, we've seen Peter Thiel and Elon Musk get very close to the heart of the US government. In Ukraine, we've seen the rollout of what they call the digital state, which is now being proposed as the model for all other countries to emulate. And indeed, virtually all countries now have something called a Ministry for Digital Transformation or something along those lines. So this is happening everywhere. Financially, the central bank digital currencies and the stable coins all leading to the creation of a centralized global financial system, which the Bank for International Settlements calls a global unified ledger. And so you can see all of this coming together fast now in real time. And this technocratic architecture of oppression is now all around us. Smartphones are the primary weapon in this. Most people can't live without a smartphone, but by that very token, they are essentially hooked to the system in a way that they can't escape from. So yes, this is what's going on. They use the 2030 timeline repeatedly, of course, to kind of mark their agenda and when they want to get this done by. And we are very much now in a war for human freedom, because if we do end up in a system where everything is digitized, everything is online, then it follows that those who control the algorithms, those who control the digital system, will have total control over all of us. And so it might very well be that you might bravely say, no, I never want to take another vaccine for as long as I live. But if the system has complete control over your life through, let's say, your bank account, if you say the wrong things, if you express the wrong opinions as a dissident, then you might find that your ability to spend money is made conditional. You might only be able to spend it on certain things, in certain places, at certain times. Or, worst case scenario, your money supply could be turned off altogether. Now, under those kinds of circumstances, that is a powerful disciplining device. And even though you might have bravely said, no, I'm never going to do X, Y, and Z, well, it might be that when you find that your very means of survival are under threat, that you will in fact do X, Y, and Z. So this is coming down the tracks fast now. It's coming hard, and we all need to resist it.
is a bit of a sidetrack, but do you see the war on Iran in the similar context?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I've argued is that all geopolitical conflicts now, while real and while serving particular geopolitical purposes, must be seen within the context of the broader global class war. So I mentioned Ukraine, for example. Now, obviously, that was a geopolitical conflict at one level, but what did it ultimately lead to? The Ukrainian digital state, which is now being proposed as the model for all countries. So there was an additional level to this, which leads to, again, the technocratic enslavement or subjugation at the very least of the global population. Now, in terms of Iran, it's early days. Who knows what the ultimate agendas there might be? But already here in the UK, I have seen petrol prices go up by about 20%. It reminds me somewhat of the steep rise in inflation in the UK in 2022 when the war in Ukraine began. And so what you see is that these conflicts not only have a geopolitical dimension, but they are affecting us, the people here at home. They are making our lives harder. And I've read quite a bit of fear mongering now about the disruption of global supply chains, disruption to oil supplies, disruption to urea, which is needed by farmers, and therefore potential disruptions to the food supply. Now, who knows how all of this will ultimately manifest, but it would not surprise me in the slightest if this particular conflict is again serving part of what I call the omni war, which is a war being waged by the few against the many, by the transnational ruling class against the rest of humanity. And it's being used to make our lives harder and more difficult so that we have enough to put up with at home, just trying to pay the bills and get by. And we don't have the bandwidth, we don't have the energy to be looking at the bigger picture and understanding what's going on and taking active measures to resist.
So, just as it was for you, the COVID era sort of woke me up, and I left the mainstream to start my own channel. And as I became acquainted with the alternative space, not least in social media, I started to realize how infiltrated it is. So, your recent article about three different camps of awareness is really, I think, a must read for anyone who wants to understand the scale of this and how social media is really designed to, as you say, contain dissent. So tell us about the three different camps. Maybe you could begin with camp one and camp two.
Sure. Yeah, it sounds as though we've been on a similar journey. I've been in this space, as I say, for approximately 2 years now. And my experience has been very much as you describe, that it isn't what it seems. So my three camps of awareness framework is an attempt to make sense of this. So camp one is for the normies, the ordinary people who essentially believe whatever they hear on the television and the radio and the so-called news, whatever the politicians and the talking heads have to say, that's where they get their talking points from. They've not developed the critical thinking skills to understand that that's propaganda. They've not developed the skills to be able to challenge that and see past it. Now, unfortunately, that still seems to account for most of society, and that's how means of psychological control can be exercised. Now, as strong as Camp One is, it doesn't stop certain basic questions from being asked. For example, how did two planes destroy three towers on 9/11? Okay, this is pretty simple stuff at one level, which pretty much anybody can grasp. And when you start looking into that, the evidence is very strong that we were lied to about 9/11 and what really took place. And so what you find over time is that an increasing number of people start to ask questions about Camp One. They start to recognize actually that the mainstream media and their governments have not been telling the truth. In fact, they have been lying in a coordinated fashion for decades. So what do those people do? They essentially move to Camp Two. Now, Camp Two is a space where people are asking questions about Camp One. They are challenging Camp One. They are rejecting official narratives. They might not believe what they have been told, for example, about vaccines, or about virology, or about the pandemic, or any number of different issues. And when people first enter that space, it seems like a great relief because they realize that they're not alone. And contrary to mainstream gaslighting, they are not crazy for questioning official narratives. In fact, many people are doing so. And so there's a kind of moment of rejoicing when they think, oh, great, well, here is the resistance, in inverted commas. Here's the opposition. Here's where I belong. And they have a tendency to uncritically trust many of the figures that they encounter in Camp 2. However, Camp 2 in many ways mimics Camp 1. It is led by a group of talking heads, very well-known individuals and organizations which put out particular ideas and narratives. And those individuals and organizations are artificially boosted. They receive very large numbers of views on social media. They're all over the place. You can't get away from them if you're in this space. And many people fall for what these individuals and organizations have to say. They do not realize that they are being deliberately misled and that their trust is being won in some ways because these actors do tell the truth about certain issues in order to win people's trust, but then they ultimately betray them by not telling more significant truths or keeping certain issues hidden or not up for discussion. Camp 2 becomes even more problematic because in addition to having these bad actors leading it and many people being deceived by them, you also have a separate type of bad actor, which is the grifter. And there are many grifters and charlatans in Camp 2 who are looking, again, essentially to abuse people's trust by telling the truth about certain issues, but their aim is not ultimately to challenge power. It's not ultimately to get to the truth. It's to make money. And they've realized that there is money to be made in this space. So again, this is enormously problematic. And what you find ultimately is that Camp 2 is a place of enormous division by design. You can go back to a paper in 2009, an academic journal article written by two Harvard professors, Cass Sunstein and Adrian Vermeule, in which they talk about the need for government agents to infiltrate chat rooms and online and indeed offline spaces in order to disrupt what was then called the 9/11 truth movement. So we know that state actors have been involved in this for a very long time. In the UK, for example, we know about the military's 77th Brigade, which is designed very much for these kinds of purposes. And when you understand that all of this is going on, you have to exercise an enormous degree of discernment and care when consuming Camp 2 content, because most of it isn't what you think it is. So for those who are able to apply the same kind of level of critical thinking to Camp 2 as they have done to Camp 1, then they start to move towards Camp 3, which is a lonely, isolating and not very pleasant place to be. But it's where you do find people who are authentically pursuing the truth, authentically trying to challenge power, and where you might get more of an idea of something at least approximating the truth. But my realization through doing this work has been that Camp 3, unfortunately, is minuscule in relation to Camp 2, just as Camp 2 is pretty small in relation to Camp 1. And so there are these different layers that you have to kind of work your way through. Of course, it's possible that maybe there are even more camps still. Some have argued that there may be a Camp 4 that when your level of awareness becomes great enough, you start to recognize the fundamental religious and spiritual dimension to all of this. So it does require a certain degree of humility to understand that you don't see everything, that you do get certain things wrong, and so on. But the point is, it's a journey, it's a process. It requires constant vigilance. It requires a lot of work to be doing this. And what you can't do if you're trying to get to the truth is to just pick out two or three of your favorite talking heads, whoever they may be, and think that you can blindly trust them, because you can't trust anybody, actually. You have to be asking critical questions about everyone. So that's my three camps in a nutshell.
Yeah. So we'll get back to Camp 3, but if we stay for a while with Camp 2, you say that it's designed to sort of hoover up skeptics. So it's always led by these very well-known figures in the alternative media scene, and their view counts tend to be artificially boosted by the algorithms. What do you think? Are they aware that they're playing this kind of role? Or how do you see them, these famous leaders?
I think the key individuals must be aware. They must know exactly what their role is from the very beginning. In the context of 9/11, for example, if we take the role of Stephen E. Jones in trying to discredit the work of Dr. Judy Wood and to suppress knowledge about cold fusion, he was very early onto the scene, more or less simultaneous with Wood. It was clear what his role was from the beginning, and you can tell that it's not accidental because you can look at his past history. And back in, was it 1989 or the early 90s, sometime around then, he was actively engaged in trying to shut down cold fusion research. So individuals like this, and of course ties to Los Alamos and so on, the military-industrial complex, it's pretty clear, really, what their role is. Again, the fact that there are certain individuals and organizations who are just relentlessly promoted and boosted is deeply suspicious. And what you find as well is that they tend to engage in propaganda rather than genuine truth seeking. So they dress it up to look like truth seeking, but what they are essentially engaging in is a one-way form of communication in which they are trying to get you to believe in something. And again, that's exactly how it works with Camp 1. So we have to be deeply skeptical of these individuals.
Yeah. Yeah, some of them, I mean, they get like view counts, like 100 millions and so on. But then there are also a group which I maybe would call the useful idiots. They are sort of have large egos and they get boosted, and they might not realize that they're actually being used in this way.
Yeah.
And I don't think that everybody's in the know, so to speak. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So one of the things that I take care to stress in terms of my three camps model is that it's not simple, that there are kind of various gray areas and areas of overlap between the three camps. And some people may go so far in their journey and come back, or have, a foot in Camp 3 on certain issues, but not on others. And what you're describing is very important, because I think there are many people in Camp 2 who are not intentionally bad actors. And yet they help to fill that space because they have been deceived in various ways. And when they start, when they engage in promoting certain positions, they will find that the algorithms pick up on that and help to boost them as well, however unwittingly. What's interesting to me about that is it's consistent with NATO's cognitive warfare doctrine. So if you read the NATO documents from 2020, it talks about how traditional forms of propaganda seek to essentially get people to believe something, but that's kind of the end of it. Whereas what you get with social media is something much more advanced, where people not only come to believe something, but they themselves become the active agents of propagating that and advancing that position even further. And so we have this very active network on social media in particular, in which you don't necessarily have to be a bad actor. But if you are putting forward certain positions which are favorable to the control system, you'll nevertheless find yourself being promoted and boosted anyway.
Mm. And one way of describing this sort of strategy is like they have one narrative, they want you to believe in this. And in case you don't, then they have this, you're going to go here.
Yes.
So you say that one thing which is very significant for both actually Group 1 and Group 2 is what you call false dichotomies. Can you explain?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, again, with 9/11, the Camp 1 narrative is that planes and Muslim hijackers were to blame. The main Camp 2 narrative is nanothermite and extreme temperatures, or other people argue that mini nukes were involved, again, involving extreme temperatures. And so long as you remain trapped in that paradigm, you don't consider that there may be a third option. So what I've argued in my work is that actually, I mean, obviously Camp 1 is ridiculous, that the planes of the Muslim hijackers doesn't make any sense. But also, when you look critically at Camp 2, I can't see any evidence that extreme temperatures, extremely high temperatures, were involved in the destruction of the Twin Towers. So that discredits both the nanothermite and the mini nukes position. And then it means that you have to be looking exactly where they don't want you to look, which is towards the work of Dr. Judy Wood and the evidence that she presents, which is profoundly challenging to both Camp 1 and Camp 2. So that's one example of a false dichotomy in play. Another might have to do with the alleged virus in 2020. And so we were encouraged to believe, first of all, that there is a deadly virus rampaging around the world, which the actual mortality statistics did not bear out in 2020. For example, in the UK, when looking at the official data for age-standardized all-cause mortality, 2020 was something like the 9th or 10th worst year in the 21st century. In other words, right in the middle. Nothing extraordinary at all. No extraordinary pandemic. So it's easy enough to disprove the Camp 1 position on the virus, but then we get a Camp 2 position, which was that it was made in a lab, and that it's some form of bioweapon, and that it emerged from Wuhan. And so again, so long as you remain trapped in that paradigm, you're thinking, well, either it's a real virus, it's a naturally occurring virus, and it's highly deadly, or it's an artificially manufactured virus, but it's still really bad and really deadly. Once you're in that dichotomy, what you're not open to is the idea that perhaps there was no virus, and perhaps the whole thing was a very complex psychological warfare operation. And that's the position that I arrive at in my book. And of course, it takes a lot of arguing to make that case, because it's a very complex issue, and prima facie people would say no way. But actually, I think that was the case. To my mind, the authorities did not prove to me, or beyond reasonable doubt, that SARS-CoV-2 existed. And again, I get into all of that in the book. But the key point here is that you have this what I consider to be a false dichotomy. The mainstream narrative on the virus, the lab leak narrative, and so long as you're in that, you're not going to be thinking, well, actually, perhaps it was all psychological warfare. So they're very, very good at giving you two choices in order to prevent you from looking at the third.
Yeah. So another typical trick, I would say, is to play into the right-left divide in politics. So what I used to see often, slogans like, on the Facebook feed, is stop the socialism or communism or World Economic Forum. And I don't know whether there's truth to that, but I mean, it also creates sort of confusion if you want to talk about it like a class warfare, and then they call it communism. Is that also something which sort of is kind of crazy making?
Yes, I'm glad you bring that up. I try not to use the terms socialism and communism and fascism, because for me, they're very specific to the 20th century. I mean, they're complex terms even in terms of the 20th century usage, but we're looking at something quite different today when faced by the challenge of global technocracy. And it does infuriate me when I hear people refer to the World Economic Forum as a communist or a Marxist organization. And to me, that just seems so kind of illiterate, when you consider that Klaus Schwab was overtly promoting stakeholder capitalism. That this is just a very lazy use of terms, and it's not helpful. It only generates confusion. But the very right-left paradigm itself is largely rooted in liberal democracy. And as liberal democracy itself now comes unstuck, and indeed is being deliberately unpicked, that paradigm as well isn't terribly helpful anymore, because the war that we're facing it's not a horizontal war. It's not, between nations or whatever. It's a vertical war between classes. And it's the same in all countries. Those in charge are now doing whatever they can through the Omni War to suppress the rest of us. And if we kind of remain caught up in these kind of left-right distinctions, or the idea, again, the false dichotomies, well, maybe a new party is going to help. In the UK, people are recognizing now that both Labour and Conservative are, bankrupt essentially in terms of what they have to offer. Well, maybe the Reform Party or maybe another party will come and save us. Well, no, I'm afraid that's not the case either, because the entire democratic system now is under threat. So, yeah, it becomes very difficult because what we see is people essentially clinging to older ways of thinking, or ways of thinking which would have made sense perhaps a few years ago. But since 2020, we have to jettison a lot of that intellectual baggage and really start to work things out afresh.
You write in your article that those in Camp 3 are banned, shadow banned, and otherwise censored. The algorithms work against them. Videos which are being watched tens of thousands of times show view counts in the tens or perhaps the hundreds. And it made me think of my own channel. I noticed that certain interviews, they very fast reach like 3,000 or something, like within a few hours. And then the count just comes to a halt, like it's a glass ceiling, and then maybe it's adding just a few hundreds for the next weeks or something. So first I was thinking algorithms, but then I was thinking it's just a number, really. I mean, anybody could write. How can you know if it's 36,000 or 25? I mean, how do you see that? Is that algorithms, or is somebody manually changing the numbers to look bad or to promote someone?
Well, it's both. I mean, it's the algorithms, but the algorithms are, of course, responding to instructions that somebody somewhere has keyed in. Those instructions don't necessarily need to be against you personally, but maybe against, all content creators that are pushing a certain position.
Yeah, I was just thinking algorithms. I mean, as I understand them, they sort of decide how many people can see this in different feeds and so on. But my followers, I guess they would still see that there's a new video and they would watch it. If so, but just changing the number, it seems like a typical thing for a three-letter agency or something, just to have somebody go through and just bring it down.
Absolutely. And again, this is the kind of the power of the algorithm ghetto. And I mean, it's been known for many years, since 2020 at least, of course, going back beyond then, that on YouTube, for example, Facebook, and these major platforms, that the dissident content, even before being banned or shadow banned, was being severely throttled in terms of the apparent view count. I had an interesting conversation a few months ago with somebody who used to run a major alternative media platform, and they were saying they knew for a fact that as certain content was going out live, it was getting about 90,000 views live. And then you'd look on YouTube on their feed, and it was about 1,000. I mean, that's the scale of it, barely giving them 1% of the actual total. And of course, this is all designed to make us look fringe. Now, where it gets more and more nefarious is it's not just those really major platforms. It's platforms like Substack, which advertised itself as a free speech platform that wasn't going to engage in this kind of behavior. And it won a lot of people over, and many people joined, many independent content creators, because it looked like a genuine alternative for a while. But I think over the last 12 months at least, more and more people have been asking critical questions about Substack in terms of what they considered to be manipulations of view counts, subscriptions, unsubscriptions, etc. That was before we got to the debacle in December 2025, when Substack started requiring biometric identification for certain people in certain parts of the world to be able to access content. And I've been quite interested because I chose to move all of my paid subscribers away from Substack onto my own website at that point. And what I've noticed is that before I did that, my subscriber count had essentially plateaued. It had gone flat. And it had done for a couple of months. And I just kind of shrugged my shoulders. Oh, well, okay. Maybe there's nothing to it. I mean, other people have been reporting precipitous declines in their subscribers. So I thought, well, who knows? Fascinatingly, since I've got off Substack, I'm now with Ghost. I'm noticing that subscriber count just going back up again. And so I'm thinking that probably was manipulated, actually. They probably were quietly removing subscribers just to keep me in my place and make sure I don't reach too many people, etc. So it's really devious the way they do this. It's horrible.
So you mentioned 9/11 and how the official narrative, like the 19 hijackers coordinated by bin Laden, and then the alternative narrative with the controlled demolition. And as an example of Camp 3, you mentioned Judy Wood and her claims of there being some kind of secret energy weapon. So I guess some people would probably, object that this kind of narrative that she comes with, that's like a flat earth things to make the narrative sound crazy and so on. So what is your response? And why did you choose Judy Wood to represent Camp 3?
Well, I mean, it's to do with evidence, and technically speaking, she's not proposing a concrete hypothesis for what did or didn't destroy the Twin Towers. She's saying here's 500 pages of evidence, and that's what we have to look at. And to me, when you look at the evidence, it stacks up in terms of very peculiar things happening, which do not fit the claims of either Camp 1 or Camp 2. And so when you look at, for example, the toasted cars or the molecular dissociation, when you look at the lack of steam explosions as millions of gallons of water was poured onto what we are told was molten metal, when you look at the grapplers still functioning, etc., you can see that this was not a high temperature event. The dust clouds, thousands of people were caught up in those dust clouds. They didn't burn everybody. So again, if those towers had been destroyed at hundreds or thousands of degrees Celsius, Fahrenheit, Kelvin, take your pick, you would have thought people would have been very badly damaged by that, but they weren't. The relative lack of damage to anything underground, the relative lack of damage to the bathtub. I mean, this is not crazy stuff designed to muddy the waters. This is hard evidence. Okay, you can look at all of that yourself with your own eyes and make your own inferences from that. That to me is very different from, let's say, flat Earth, where I think there are serious questions to be asked and which to me haven't persuasively been answered at all. So again, it's not to endorse every element of Judy Wood's work. There's one or two areas that I'm skeptical of, but on the whole, it is more than enough for us to say whatever it was that destroyed the Twin Towers is not easily explained by publicly known science and technology.
So it dismisses basically both Camp 1 and Camp 2. And for somebody without any prior knowledge, I guess maybe it's hard to summarize such a complex, but how could you summarize just briefly her take on 9/11?
Well, as I say, she tries to avoid proposing theories per se, but the sheer volume of evidence that she adduces is quite staggering, and she points to all kinds of things which I don't think anybody would actually have looked at or noticed had it not been for her. For example, the damage to the Bankers Trust building nearby and the peculiar rusting effects, and the fact that they chose to take that entire building down a few years later. That all demands explanation. The fact that the debris was more or less at ground level immediately after the destruction of the towers, as can be demonstrated from photographic evidence. Again, if those towers had, in inverted commas, collapsed 110 stories tall, I mean, I think they were the fifth and sixth tallest buildings in the world at the time. If they'd have come straight down, not only would they have created massive underground damage, but just think about the massive size of the debris pile that you would have had. I mean, there would have been debris absolutely everywhere, and there wasn't. Hence the title of her book, Where Did the Towers Go? Actually, it's an extraordinary mystery, and it would appear, when you look at the evidence, that most of them were indeed dustified, to use her terminology, turned to dust and blew away in the wind. Now, again, that sounds like an absolutely extraordinary proposition, but just think back to the size of the dust clouds and how long all of that dust was blowing for. Um, it actually stacks up when you look at the evidence, and this is the point. So it's kind of science versus propaganda. Um, Wood points to the hard evidence, and it makes scientific sense, as difficult as that might be for people to wrap their minds around. I mean, we are told in official science, for example, that there's no such thing as cold fusion, and that it never has been possible, and even if it were possible, it would be decades away. Well, you look at the evidence that Wood presents, I mean, it does look for all the world as though some kind of cold fusion process is taking place there. So again, it takes us to uncomfortable places because we're almost certainly then looking at classified military technology. We're definitely not looking at Muslim hijackers and aeroplanes. And then it really does start to become very, very sinister when you start considering the implications of that.
Yes. So you say that just as Camp 1 uses terms like anti-vaxxer and anti-Semite to stigmatize opponents and close down debate, in Camp 2 they use terms like shill and control opposition. But I mean, how would you describe, for instance, like the forces behind the QAnon psyop? Isn't that really a form of controlled opposition?
Yeah, it would seem that way, wouldn't it? It's an attempt to encourage people to outsource responsibility for doing anything themselves. So these kind of fake savior figures are presented, in this case known as white hats. And we're told, don't worry, guys, everything will be okay. Trust the plan. The white hats have got it. There's these really good guys there working behind the scenes to counter everything that's going on. Really? I see no evidence of that, nor does that make any particular sense to me. And so it seems like a yet another operation that is designed to minimize resistance. I mean, if people were to really understand what's been going on since 2020 and indeed before, I mean, there would be massive resistance, if not revolution, overnight. And so the whole game becomes psyops, essentially. You have to find as many different ways as you can to stop people from understanding what's going on, or to make them outsource their responsibility, even if they do, or to keep them trapped in states of fear and confusion and so on, so that they don't actually take any meaningful action. It's quite incredible the age that we live in, because we have the numbers on our side. Mass non-compliance is a very straightforward way of putting an end to this technocratic agenda, and that's why they are throwing absolutely everything that they have at propagandizing us and using various other forms of mind control. They're even looking at forms of direct neurological control, everything that they have to try and stop this kind of awareness from spreading. It shows how vulnerable their position is.
So what is your point then with the control opposition, that it's also being used a bit like a buzzword to throw on anybody? Or
The part that you read out has really to do with ad hominem attacks. So if we're serious about getting to the truth, what we need to do is to look at evidence and evaluate that. What is not helpful in terms of getting to the truth is name calling. So, calling somebody an anti-Semite or an anti-vaxxer, as the mainstream media does, that's a form of propaganda. Okay, all that is designed to do is to try and discredit them or to call them a conspiracy theorist. Unfortunately, it's surprising how effective this is when it's the mainstream. Many people are really scared actually of being called those kind of terms, and they'll deliberately self-censor. They'll stay quiet because they don't want to be labeled in that way. But again, when we get to Camp 2, and if there's a point of dispute, and somebody just resorts to name calling, oh, you're a shill, you're controlled opposition, or whatever, in a sense, they've already lost the argument because that is not an argument. Again, that's just a propagandistic form of trying to discredit someone. So one of the points I make in my guide to identifying Camp 2 is that many of the propaganda techniques that are used in Camp 1 are also used in Camp 2. And once we start to see that and identify that, it becomes quicker and easier to actually identify if somebody might be in Camp 2 rather than Camp 3.
So regarding then controlled opposition, let's talk about German lawyer Reiner Fuellmich. He's a hero for many people in the alternative movement, especially in Camp 2. He became a leading voice as a spokesperson for the Corona Investigative Committee. For people who don't know the background, I just want to play a short clip that I found.
In 2020, the world faced the biggest pandemic ever. But was it really a pandemic? How much science used at that time can be proven to be true? Or was it an orchestrated takeover of our lives? A few experts and lawyers stood up to challenge the official narrative. One of them was Dr. Reiner Fuellmich, a renowned international lawyer who initiated the Corona Investigative Committee. After collecting many official testimonies with other experts, he came to the conclusion that the whole COVID pandemic was a lie to force people into getting injected with undisclosed substances. Fuellmich became the voice of the people worldwide who were fighting against vaccine mandates and lockdowns. He was the last hope to bring these people to jail for crimes against humanity. Was this a violation of the Nuremberg Code? But governmental and corporate forces behind the pandemic were working furiously to stop Fuellmich at any cost.
Yeah, so then he was arrested, and for many of his followers, there was just a proof that, he almost like became like a martyr. So tell us, how did you start to become suspicious of him, and what did you find?
Well, it's very recent, really. In December 2025, I was having a private conversation with people who were quite close to the Corona Investigative Committee, and they were expressing their own private doubts about the role of Reiner Fuellmich. And I found what they had to say was very, very interesting. I personally was on the fence before then, but it sounded quite persuasive to me. And then separately, somebody sent me the legal verdict on the Fuellmich case in January or February 2026. And I took a read through it. And for me, it was a very clear case of guilty. There's a lot of hard facts and evidence in that judgment, which I present in parts 1 and 2 of my series, easily enough to conclude that he was guilty of embezzling funds. He took them from the committee and used them for his own private use. He sent a lot of them to his wife's bank account. They were being spent on things like divorce costs relating to a previous marriage, standing orders to his wife's daughter from a previous marriage, gardening costs, all kinds of things. And so the idea that he was kind of somehow keeping this money safe and liquid so that it could be returned to the Corona Investigative Committee at any time simply doesn't hold water. And again, there's a lot in the judgment about this, which I've written up. But this wasn't the only suspicious activity that he was engaged in. He was also running a promised transnational class action lawsuit with another lawyer called Marcel Templin, in which clients would pay €800 plus VAT, so €1,000 in total, to sign up to be part of this. And the idea was that somehow they were going to use the Anglo-American legal system to get justice for German entrepreneurs and business owners who had been harmed by the COVID measures, by the government's measures. I mean, how that would even be possible in the first place is anybody's guess. Now, they raised well over €1 million, and that lawsuit never materialized. €500,000 of the money that they raised then went to paying off a mortgage of Fuellmich. So the remaining money, would it even have been enough to launch such a lawsuit? Who knows? In addition, Fuellmich was paying himself €25,000 a month from Corona Investigative Committee funds. And this went on for 17 months without anybody noticing, allegedly. I mean, it begs the question, how could nobody notice? But that was a total of over €500,000 that went into his accounts. There are questions to be asked about the sale of his house eventually. As I say, €500,000 came from the class action lawsuit funds and were legally extended to him by Marcel Templin. When it came to selling the house, it was found that there was encumbrances on the property, which meant that it couldn't be sold until this was taken care of. Well, Marcel Templin at that point then demanded something like €1.2 million to be paid to him by the buyers of this property, which is what actually happened. So not just the original $500,000, but 1.2 million went to Templin, who had been working directly with Fuellmich on this class action lawsuit. None of it went back to the Corona Investigative Committee. So Templin is also making money here. Then there's the issue of the gold. Fuellmich took €975,000 and bought gold with it, which he then had placed in the houses of friends of his. Now, in and of itself, there was nothing illegal about that. But the question is, what would have happened had Viviana Fischer not intervened? She made sure that the gold was housed not with his friends, but with a proper gold dealer in Berlin called Degussa. Now, we don't know. It's slightly speculative. But again, that's an awful lot of money. The gold has since doubled in price and is now said to be worth around €2 million. So what we're seeing here are fantastic sums of money, many millions of euros in total. And this was all donated by the public in good faith that something good would come about. Well, what has the public actually received? As I say, the transnational lawsuit went nowhere. The Corona Committee, okay, it produced several years of high quality, professionally produced live feeds in which international experts were interviewed. But what else? I mean, if you look at its website, it claims to want to investigate the what took place during COVID. But I mean, many people have been doing that. So that clip that you played, Fuellmich, he was this great guy. He did all these interviews. He came to the conclusion that the pandemic was fake and, a pretext and not what we were told. Well, lots of people actually were doing this work. I mean, look at somebody like Hrvoje Moric of Geopolitics and Empire. It wouldn't surprise me if he has conducted more interviews, in fact, than the Corona Investigative Committee, of all kinds of people, not just people that he agrees with, but also people that he disagrees with from a more balanced view. Now, did he need millions of euros to be doing that work? No, he's certainly not received millions of euros. And so we have to be open to the fact that all of this was a gigantic money-making scheme. And in parts 3 and 4 of my series, I then look at Fuellmich's past history. And it's really quite shocking what you find. You can go back as far as 1999, and there was a documentary made by the mainstream German broadcaster ZDF, and there is a consumer protection agency there talking about Fuellmich's role as a consumer protection lawyer, and essentially saying he's not serious. What he does is he puts on these big kind of spectacles to get people to pay in money, but he wasn't really winning many cases at all. And so they were asking critical questions over 20 years ago. And they also linked him at the time to Scientology, which is a pretty serious thing because Scientology has links to US intelligence. And so we have to ask questions about, well, who is this man in the first place? I mean, allegedly, he was born in Bremen in 1958, and there's no mention that I could find of him living abroad during his childhood. And yet he has a perfect American accent and is perfectly bilingual. So that to me suggests there are definitely links there to the United States. Those links remain unexplained. And just all kinds of other things he's been involved in. There was an initiative called Financial Turnaround, which again was supposed to be kind of helping citizens. And then it turned out that this organization had been ultimately, through kind of various shell foundations, been receiving money from the George Soros Open Society Foundation. And when that information came out, Fuellmich had his name as the founder of this financial turnaround organization removed. So it's all highly, highly suspicious. And unfortunately, when you put it all together, what you find is somebody who appears dishonest. And the one thing I've not mentioned yet, which perhaps is the most obvious way of thinking about this, that clip you played talked about renowned international lawyer, Reiner Fuellmich. This is a phrase which is often used, and it's often used in relation to the lawsuits which he claims to have been engaged in against Volkswagen and Deutsche Bank, in particular, massive class action lawsuits against these corporate behemoths. And in both cases, those companies were made to pay large amounts of money. And the way he's framed it has been as though he was somehow primarily or played certainly a central or very important role in the legal victories against those companies. And many of his critics uncritically accept this and make the same claim themselves. But I can't find any evidence that he was even a trial lawyer in either case. And it astounds me that nobody has taken the time to do the due diligence to ask, well, is it even true that he played a major role in the Volkswagen and Deutsche Bank cases? And this is an opportunity for his supporters to prove me wrong. Okay, so this is this is an open and honest approach of mine, because I'm saying, well, perhaps I've got it wrong. I'm not aware. I can't find any evidence that he was. So if you're telling me that your hero was in fact a major player in those cases, just provide me the evidence. Send me a case reference number, send me some legal documents, send me some hard proof that he was what he claimed to be in 2020 before he began this Corona Investigative Committee business and the transnational lawsuit. Well, I put that out about 3 weeks ago. And once I did, all of the howls of outrage and anguish, because many people apparently can't handle the fact that I'm criticizing their hero, they all died down and disappeared, and I'm still waiting. Nobody has sent me hard evidence that he was what he claimed to be. Now, if his own supporters can't prove that he was this big shot lawyer that was involved in bringing down, their words, Volkswagen and Deutsche Bank, then why should we trust him? And that's on top of all of these other deeply suspicious questions that there are to be asked about him. So, yeah, I've received a lot of backlash over this, particularly after parts 1 and 2 of my series. People were saying, oh, you've been deceived. You've been taken in, the corrupt German state, has persecuted him, etc. Well, no, I don't think so. I think when you look at the evidence in its entirety, we are looking at a guilty man here.
Well, there's so many aspects to this. I remember when he first started out that he was just saying when something seems too good to be true, it's usually not true. So this was going to be call it Nuremberg 2.0, and it's like you put all your eggs in one basket. And another expression you call something hopium. You create this a little bit like So the question that comes to my mind when I read your articles is sort of, is he a con man just in the sense that he was sort of seduced by greed and wanted to make money? Or is it some deeper layer to this, you think, that he actually was a deceiver?
Well, we can't know for sure. But as I say, the 1999 ZDF documentary is most revealing because not only does it show that his modus operandi of generating these American-style spectacles rather than just doing solid law, that goes all the way back 21 years pre-COVID, and then he's doing it again in 2020. That suggests a pattern. So certainly, I mean, given the amounts of money that we're looking at, I mean, maybe he was laughing at one stage at people's gullibility. Millions and millions and millions of euros flowing in. And for what? For a promise that there's going to be Nuremberg 2.0. I mean, Nuremberg 1.0 wasn't what it claimed to be. So the idea that there's going to be, it was nonsense from the beginning. Then to your question as to whether there's something deeper to this, we can't know. But Uwe Alschner has offered an interesting hypothesis to consider, which is that given Fuellmich's links to Scientology and therefore possibly US intelligence, if he is an intelligence asset, and we don't have any hard evidence that he is, but then Alschner suggests that his role may have been to create what he called depression about fallen angels. In other words, to demoralize people, to demoralize the opposition and the resistance, because so much hope and so much faith was placed in this man. And of course, for many people, things like the Corona Investigative Committee were a lifeline during 2020 and 2021, when there was so much darkness. And at least there you saw what appeared to be an attempt to grapple with and get to the truth. And people invested heavily in these characters, and particularly Reiner Fuellmich. But all of that to then be unraveled, and you realize, oh my goodness, this man, was just either out to make money or worse. The psychological impact that will have on many people will be quite devastating, actually. And the fact that there appeared to be so few heroes in the first place, and now one of the big ones turns out to be anything but. I mean, that would be a wonderful intelligence play, would it not? If you're trying to get people to just give up and think, oh, there's absolutely no way of challenging power, and even this big shot lawyer that we thought was going to challenge power, even he turns out to be a fraud.
Yeah, and you wrote about also that you were fiercely attacked by his supporters, and I mean, I understand, of course, the same thing I happened to me when I criticized QAnon, because some people are maybe, they're paid to attack you, but some people it's genuine, as you say, it's a lifeline, and you take away basically their religion, so of course it creates a lot of rage and despair. But I remember one very common theme, which is sort of especially in the camp too, is like often people would say, we have to stay together, we have to stick together, we shouldn't create infighting. And I was thinking, at some level it's true. I mean, if we all become paranoid, nobody can trust anyone, that's no good. But if we just say we would be living in Eastern Germany and it would become a new initiative, it would be quite logical to ask, okay, does it have any connection to Stasi, to the secret police? So I guess but you have to find a balance between becoming completely paranoid, but also to, of course, when these prophets come along, to ask the critical questions.
Yeah, and again, in terms of the parallels between Camp 1 and Camp 2, what were we told repeatedly in 2020? We're all in this together against the virus. We're all in it together. And now, what do we find among all manner of Camp 2 talking heads? We're all in it together against Camp 1. And if you challenge that, then you're not really part of the resistance. You're dividing the resistance and so on. And it's all a very phony narrative because we're not in this together. Camp 2 is a viper's nest. It's full of bad actors. It's full of people deliberately trying to mislead others and take them astray. So, let's be honest about that. It's full of hidden networks. It's full of vested interests and, people receiving money that you don't necessarily suspect of receiving money to do certain things. This is going on all the time. And so for me, whenever anybody comes out with that line that we're all in it together, don't divide the resistance, that to me is itself a hallmark of Camp 2 and is something to be treated with great suspicion.
Mm. So before we wrap up, we talked mostly about Camp 2, but so you have written books about mass compliance and brainwashing and so on. So I wonder, what do you say today, if let's say on a dinner party, to people of Camp 1, if they tell you that, listen, the COVID measures and the vaccines itself saved millions of lives, do you have like a standard response?
No, I don't have a standard response. It is very, very much context specific. And my key piece of advice would be to tread very delicately and very carefully, because those in Camp 1 typically have no idea that they are. Their minds, their thought processes have been manipulated in all kinds of abusive ways that they don't understand, that they don't even realize has happened. You run the risk of cognitive dissonance. If you challenge some of their hallowed beliefs around terrorists or vaccines or whatever else, then some people will either just fall out with you forever, which you don't want with close friends and family, or they might even get very angry and aggressive. So actually, in those kind of very close personal circumstances, you are running a great risk if you try challenging certain narratives. And personally, I tend not to. I'm a special case perhaps because people tell me that I have been able to reach their friends and relatives, people I don't know, but those people will listen to me rather than them. So I take solace from the fact that I know that I am getting through to people, just complete strangers that I don't know. But it is very hard in one's own personal circumstances. You have to be extremely careful, and especially if your relatives, just kind of buy the mainstream daily newspapers and get their worldview from there, you're on quite tricky ground. That said, I still look for opportunities to drop in small little items. For example, last week I went to the gym and I was in the sauna afterwards, and two other guys who I didn't know came in afterwards, and they're having a conversation, and they're saying, one guy was saying, my girlfriend, it all started around the time of that COVID nonsense, and she got this horrendous rash all over her body, kind of from the neck down, and then eventually it went away, but she's still getting sick, like several times a year. She keeps getting sick, and I don't understand what it is. And we sleep together every night, and I'm always fit and healthy, and I let them just kind of talk about this for a while. And the other guy was saying, "Oh yeah, it's very, very strange, isn't it? What do the doctors say?" "Oh, the doctors are baffled." And then after they'd kind of talked it through, I just very gently said, "Did it all start after she'd had the COVID vaccine?" And the guy said, "Oh, yeah, actually it did." And you could see that in itself was probably enough to set those kind of thought processes rolling. But you've got to be extremely careful. It's not an easy skill at all. So, yeah, much as we'd like to be able to go out and loudly beat our drum and proselytize and yell from the rooftops about what's going on, we need to be very careful about the tactics that we use for actually getting our message across.
Yeah. So what is the main takeaway from all this in terms of going forward, in terms of resisting global technocracy?
To do something and to take responsibility for doing something. It's not my role to tell each and every individual what it is that they should or shouldn't be doing. I mean, I often talk about things like ditching the smartphone or trying to resist all of the technologies which are necessary for technocracy. But the problem goes much wider than that. We are in an omni-war. We are being attacked through every dimension of human existence. And what we do have on our side is numbers. There's 8 billion of us, reportedly, very few of them. So actually, if we could just get enough people up and active, it wouldn't take too much. If enough people just did something, drew their line in the sand and refused to take any more of what is being done to us. Of course, it's not always easy, but the point I like to make is that everybody can do something. Everybody has their own skill set, their own areas of opportunity in life. Begin by doing something. Look into your own heart, and if your conscience is troubling you, that very, very bad things are taking place in this world, which will be bad not only for you but for your children and your grandchildren, and that you must challenge this, then you have to take action. As I say, what that might be in your specific case is very much specific to you, but take that responsibility and make sure that you do something. It's remarkable how quickly things can change and can unfold. For me, the darkest time during COVID was December 2021, when there were threats that all NHS workers would have to be jabbed. Biden in the United States was threatening that all federal workers would have to be jabbed. And then by February 2022, the whole COVID operation had been wound down. And that was very significant to me. Of course, one of the key things that happened during the intervening time was the Canadian truckers convoy, where you had thousands of people turning out in every town across Canada as the convoy passed through. An offline form of protest, not online, not something that you can just manipulate, with the algorithms, etc., but clear, visible signs of mass dissent. And all of a sudden, they chose to wind down the operation at that point. So we must never underestimate our power. They use the psyops to make things look difficult, if not impossible or overwhelming for us. But no. If enough people just get up and active, then there are tremendous possibilities actually for resistance.
So finally, David, where can people go to follow your work and to support your work?
The main place is my website, davidahughes.net. So all of my work is on there. I should add, since leaving academia, I don't have a salary anymore. I'm not employed anymore. I'm self-employed. So I'm entirely reliant now on public support to keep doing this work. I did have some offers of sponsorship last summer, which I turned down because I did not want to be financially beholden to anyone. So if you do like my work, if you do value my content, please consider taking out a subscription or visiting the support tab for other ways of supporting my work. I am still temporarily on Substack, although all my content there kind of comes out at least a week later than on my website, and I've closed down the comments on Substack, etc. I'm trying not to feed the beast. Eventually, I'll get rid of the Substack site altogether. But as I say, the main place is davidahughes.net.
David Hughes, I can pronounce it. It's been a great pleasure to have you on. Thank you.
Likewise, yeah, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity. It's been great.